Welcome back to That's Entertainment, the weekly show where we look at everything in the entertainment space. Today we have our special guest, Andy Chatterley, back with us. Andy is the CEO and co-founder of MUSO, the anti-piracy tracking tool. Welcome back, Andy. Nice to see you again.
Hi, Ben. Good to see you too. I'm glad to be back. Initially, and I think before we talk about what's happening at the moment, it's good to look at what happened during the pandemic. For the film side, we saw some really incredible trends. When we first locked down, when we first went into that lockdown back in March of 2020, I think, we saw this real sharp increase globally for film content, film and TV content. And looking back with some analysis onto the data, it was as if everybody, was suddenly found themselves at home, found themselves locked down, turned to piracy. Demand was absolutely huge for this almost 4-week period of time, and then it completely declined. And what we saw at that point was this, it was almost as if everybody binge watched everything they had wanted to see on the piracy networks, and then there was nothing else to see. And then as movies were pushed back because of cinemas being closed and everything else, there just wasn't, that void wasn't really being filled. And so it took quite a long time for audience measurement when it went down to suddenly start to come up again. Now, as films and TV titles started to come back in to the release schedule, we've seen a huge acceleration of piracy, especially when we start to compare 2021 to 2022. Now, across the board, we measured a 29.3% increase in piracy visits across all media sectors, which is, really quite significant. I think it equates to 52 billion visits to piracy websites in that quarter, and broken down into the individual media sectors. I think film had a 42.5% increase year on year from 2022 to 2021. So really significant. But, TV was also at 19.2%. There was also an increase in TV. There was a huge increase in publishing. It tends to be more, especially if we focus on film for a second, it tends to be more about the release windows, the strategies, how long movies are in theatrical for, whether they're widely available, what's the pricing strategy on those movies, what's the, how long is the window, which particular territories are they releasing the theatrical to? Is it global or is it not global? What are the genres? There's some really nuanced and fascinating trends that we're seeing there. The inflation, the number of platforms, the availability of titles on piracy is almost causing a perfect storm and can perhaps be looked at to understand why we're seeing these rising numbers in the piracy data. You've still got a huge market of opportunity for the platforms to acquire customers who are not already, subscribed, but they're probably turning to piracy to watch some of those titles. But on top of that, there's only so much that households can bear, right? I mean, if you've got, 3 different subscription platforms, can you afford a fourth? Or if you've got one, can you afford a second? Or can you even afford the first one? So I think there's a huge amount of economic pressure. There's a huge amount of the market that's just simply not engaged in any kind of commercial sort of subscription because they simply can't afford to. I think what's really interesting, though, is when we look at piracy, the US is consistently, one of, if not the most, always the largest, country for demand from piracy. So it's not as if piracy is being driven from the BRICS countries, especially more. It's Western countries that have developed economies that are still largely driving piracy. With TV and film, it's the proliferation of platforms, it's the siloing, the exclusive content, which is, a strategy that they needed to take and a strategy that was inevitable, for that industry. But I think that's also driven piracy up, where traditionally for music we have seen a decrease.
I think the other thing is the fact of the shortened window, right? All of a sudden there's a high quality copy of a major Hollywood production out within anything between 30 and 45 days now as standard. If we take Spider-Man, for instance, how much of an impact did that have on piracy numbers?
Spider-Man was by far the biggest piracy title, and I think from memory it had 35% of the top 10. So 35% of all of the piracy in the top 10 of that particular period was for Spider-Man. But what's really interesting with Spider-Man is when you start comparing it to its box office figures, because it did have this longer release window. And we see various different sort of trends in piracy data. But with Spider-Man, we saw this initial spike of the cam rip, the low quality cam rip quality title that we saw when it was out theatrical, and then huge demand. I mean, insane demand for that title all the way through this period of time. But at the same time, insane box office revenues as well, because looking at the data, and it's somewhat anecdotally, but it seems that the demand for cam rip on a title like that is so high, but the experience is not necessarily the experience that people want to get. Yeah. So whilst that copy is still, remaining low quality and sort of from a cinema, someone filming it, demand remains high, box office remains high. And they had, I think, from memory, was almost a 90-day window on Spider-Man, and another massive spike, obviously, when it was available digital, where that demand was taken. But if you compare that to something like Batman, for example, that has been really high in, I think, in our May data, or April or May data, it had a much shorter window, and the spike was huge when it was released digital, but it declined very, very quickly. So it's a different profile to something we see when there's longer windows. But I find it much more interesting looking below those ones and really going in the longer tail. And there was one piece that we wrote about called Blacklight that had really bad reviews, really bad box office takings. I think it was released on February the 11th, and it was quite a short window to come out on HD. And presumably that was decided well in advance of the reviews. Who knows what their actual strategy was and when it was announced. But we just saw huge demand for that title. I think for something that had such terrible reviews and such terrible box office data, the piracy was maybe up in the 35th or 36th, something like that. It was very high up our piracy stats for that particular period. Really? And I think that, yeah, it is, and it sort of, to me, when you see that information in our data, it's showing you maybe a miscalculated strategy on a title like that, because the demand globally was high. I mean, we tend not to give away numbers, but there were millions and millions and millions of streams and downloads for that title. If you can understand global demand on a title like that, and you can understand where maybe adapting the release schedule, maybe giving it slightly longer in the theatrical window might be the right move. I'm not suggesting it for that window, but I'm just saying that you can utilize, the data to make some slightly better decisions to maximize those revenues. If we look at, previous Liam Neeson films, let's say, similar movies, similar scripts, similar demographics that we're looking at, what can we learn from the windows? What can we learn from the countries of demand that we weren't previously measuring? Because again, piracy data gives you the stuff that you've not seen before. It gives you the audience data that you've not been aware of, and it's in many cases it's going to correlate with your legal data, but in other cases it won't. And it's interesting trying to find that out, really.
Piracy is obviously a much better way of actually figuring out what your sleeper hits are as well, right?
Absolutely. I mean, we saw that in a major way in our TV data for April. So there was, we see it quite often actually with South Korean titles, but in the April data, the biggest TV show, outperforming all the massive shows that we know about, was a South Korean TV show called A Business Proposal. And it was just huge. Episodically released, so we saw these big episodical spikes, but global hit, not just in South Korea or sort of America. It was a global hit, an absolute smash hit. Now I believe it's going to be available in some territories on Netflix.